A poor boy jumps into a frozen lake to save a rich man's dog, but by morning, his mother receives a call that completely changes their lives. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. Jamal Williams watched the golden retriever thrashing in the frozen lake as his soaked green jacket grew heavier, pulling him toward the dark, icy depths beneath his feet. The cutting pain of cold penetrated his bones, while he struggled to keep his head above water. The frightened dog flailed just a few feet away, its paws scratching at ice that kept breaking under its weight. On the shore, a man in an expensive suit shouted desperately, his face contorted with panic. Jamal knew he had only seconds before his muscles would stop responding completely. "Hang on, boy," Jamal called out, his voice strained as he pushed forward through the numbing water. The morning had started like any other. Jamal had woken before dawn, careful not to disturb his mother who'd returned late from her night shift cleaning offices. He'd quietly prepared for his paper route, dressing warmly against the February chill, his breath creating small clouds in the frigid air of their apartment. His asthma had been acting up lately, but they couldn't afford to refill his prescription yet. He'd tucked the empty inhaler into his pocket anyway, out of habit. The sun was just beginning to peek over the horizon as Jamal pedaled his second-hand bicycle through the quiet streets, methodically delivering newspapers to the middle-class homes on his route. The weight of the paper bag gradually lightened with each delivery, and he'd calculated that he might finish early enough to stop at the library before school. They had that veterinary medicine book he loved to browse through. Cutting through Henderson Park had seemed like a good idea to save time. The morning was crisp and clear, the frozen lake glittering under the early light. That's when he heard it, desperate shouting coming from the far side of the lake. Jamal hesitated only briefly before dropping his bicycle and bag on the path and running toward the commotion. A well-dressed man stood at the lake's edge, his expensive wool coat flapping open as he gestured frantically toward the ice. About 20 feet from shore, a large golden retriever had broken through, its front paws desperately clawing at the icy edge while its back half thrashed in the freezing water. "Max! Hold on, Max!" the man shouted, his voice cracking with fear. He looked ready to jump in himself, one foot already testing the thin ice nearest the shore. "Sir, wait!" Jamal called out, quickly assessing the situation. "The ice won't hold you." Without fully thinking it through, Jamal kicked off his worn sneakers and stripped off his old jacket, the cold immediately biting through his thin, long-sleeved shirt. He moved carefully onto the ice, testing each step while calculating the best approach to the struggling animal. "What are you doing?" the man called out, his eyes wide with alarm. "Kid, be careful." Jamal didn't answer, his focus narrowed to the dog and the treacherous surface between them. About halfway to the struggling animal, a sickening crack beneath his feet made the decision for him. The ice gave way, plunging him into water so cold it felt like thousands of needles stabbing him all at once. The shock of it stole his breath. His lungs seized, and for a terrifying moment, he couldn't move at all. Then survival instinct kicked in, and he began to swim toward the panicking dog, his limbs already growing heavy and unresponsive. "I'm coming, boy," he gasped, struggling to keep his teeth from chattering. The cold was so intense it burned, transforming quickly into a dangerous numbness that crept up from his extremities. The golden retriever paddled frantically, whimpering as it saw Jamal approaching. Its amber eyes were wide with terror, and as Jamal got closer, the dog's desperate movements threatened to push both of them under. "Easy now," Jamal soothed, his voice trembling with cold. "I've got you." Just as he reached the animal, he heard new voices. An elderly couple had appeared beside the man in the suit, the woman shouting something Jamal couldn't quite make out over the ringing in his ears. The cold was affecting his hearing, his vision starting to tunnel. "Push him this way!" The well-dressed man had gotten down on his stomach at the edge of more solid ice, extending his arms as far as he could reach. The elderly man beside him was on his phone, presumably calling for help. Jamal's fingers were so numb, he could barely feel them as he maneuvered behind the dog, using the last of his strength to push the animal toward the man's outstretched hands. The ice kept breaking as the dog struggled, but eventually, its front paws gained purchase on a thicker section. "That's it, Max! Come on, boy!" the man encouraged, his fingers just inches from the dog's collar. With one final push from Jamal, the golden retriever lunged forward enough for the man to grab its collar. In a surge of effort, the man pulled the dog onto more solid ice and then quickly to safety. Jamal tried to feel relief, but his body was shutting down. His waterlogged clothes pulled him downward, and his arms refused to keep stroking. The edges of his vision darkened as his head slipped below the surface. A strong hand suddenly gripped his wrist, pulling him up. The man in the suit had returned to the edge, now reaching for Jamal with desperate intensity. "Hold on, kid. Don't you dare give up," the man shouted, his face red with exertion as he strained to maintain his grip. With the elderly man anchoring his legs, the suited man managed to pull Jamal toward the edge. The boy's body felt impossibly heavy, his waterlogged clothes and numbed limbs offering no help. When they finally dragged him onto solid ground, Jamal lay shivering uncontrollably, unable to speak or move voluntarily. "We need to get these wet clothes off him," the elderly woman said, already removing her thick wool coat. Her husband handed her his scarf as well, and together they worked to wrap Jamal's trembling form. The golden retriever, still dripping but apparently recovering quickly, padded over to where Jamal lay. The dog whined softly and gently licked the boy's face, as if thanking him or trying to warm him. "Ambulance is on the way," the elderly man reported, pocketing his phone. "They said it might be 15 minutes. "That's too long," the suited man said decisively, checking Jamal's pulse at his neck. "He's already showing signs of severe hypothermia. His pulse is too slow." Through chattering teeth that he could no longer control, Jamal managed to mumble, "Cold." "I know, son. We're going to get you warm," the suited man assured him, his voice gentler than before. He looked up at the elderly couple. "My car is just on the other side of the park. It'll be faster than waiting." The elderly woman nodded, adjusting the coat around Jamal. "Go. We'll stay with his things." She gestured toward the abandoned bicycle and paper bag. Without hesitation, the suited man scooped Jamal into his arms. Despite his refined appearance, he was strong, lifting the boy with surprising ease. The golden retriever stayed close at his heels, still whimpering with concern. "What's your name, kid?" the man asked as he strode quickly through the park, trying to keep Jamal engaged and conscious. "J. Jamal," he managed, his voice barely audible. "Jamal W. Williams." "I'm Richard Blackwell. You saved my dog, Max," the man said, walking faster. "Just stay with me, Jamal. We're getting you help." The elderly couple watched as Richard carried the boy away, the woman clutching her husband's arm tightly. "That poor child," she murmured, gathering up Jamal's discarded jacket. As she picked it up, several papers fell from the pocket, delivery receipts, and what looked like a medical prescription. Her husband bent to retrieve them. "Asthma medication," he noted, examining the prescription. "Never filled." He glanced in the direction Richard had disappeared with Jamal. "I hope that gentleman realizes what that boy just risked for his dog." Meanwhile, Richard reached a sleek black Bentley parked at the curb. A uniformed driver jumped out as soon as he spotted his employer approaching with the shivering boy. "Hospital now," Richard commanded as the driver rushed to open the rear door. "And crank the heat as high as it will go." Inside the luxury car, Richard carefully laid Jamal across the soft leather seat, not caring about the water soaking into the expensive upholstery. Max jumped in beside them, pressing his warm body against Jamal's legs. "I need you to stay awake, Jamal," Richard urged, noticing the boy's eyelids drooping. "Tell me about yourself. Do you live nearby?" Birchwood Apartments," Jamal managed, his speech slurring slightly. "With my mom." Richard removed his own cashmere scarf, using it to gently dry Jamal's face and hair. As he did, he noticed the poor quality of the boy's clothes, threadbare in places with several inexpert mending jobs visible on the seams. "Your mom needs to know where you are," Richard said. "Do you know her phone number?" With tremendous effort, Jamal recited a number, which Richard immediately entered into his phone. The call went to voicemail, a woman's tired voice asking the caller to leave a message. "This is Richard Blackwell. Your son Jamal has had an accident. He's safe, but I'm taking him to Mercy General Hospital. Please call me at this number as soon as you can." He ended the call, tucking the phone back into his pocket. A violent shiver racked Jamal's body, followed by an alarming stillness. His breathing became shallow, his eyes unfocused. "Faster!" Richard ordered his driver, who was already speeding through intersections, ignoring red lights. "He's going into shock." Jamal felt himself drifting, the comfortable warmth of the car's interior creating a dangerous sense of drowsiness. The dog's weight against his legs seemed distant now, as did Richard's increasingly urgent voice, asking him to stay awake. Something important nagged at the edges of his consciousness. "My papers," he murmured. "Need to deliver." "Don't worry about that now," Richard assured him, checking his pulse again and not liking what he felt. "Just focus on staying with me." The car screeched to a halt at the emergency entrance of Mercy General. Before the vehicle had fully stopped, Richard was already opening the door, once again lifting Jamal into his arms. The boy's body felt lighter now, dangerously limp. Medical staff rushed out with a gurney, responding to the obvious emergency. As they transferred Jamal's nearly unconscious form onto it, one of the nurses recognized the signs immediately. "Severe hypothermia, possible secondary symptoms," she called out, already cutting away Jamal's wet clothes as they wheeled him inside. "Get warming blankets and start warm saline IV." Richard stood in the entrance, suddenly alone, except for Max sitting obediently at his feet, both of them dripping onto the hospital floor. A security guard approached, about to say something about the dog, when a nurse intercepted them. "Sir, we need information for the patient," she said, clipboard in hand. "His name is Jamal Williams," Richard replied, running a hand through his own wet hair. 13, I think. Lives at Birchwood Apartments with his mother. I've left her a message." "And your relationship to the patient?" the nurse asked. Richard hesitated, watching through the trauma room windows as doctors and nurses worked frantically over the boy who had, without hesitation, risked his life to save a stranger's dog. He held up Jamal's sodden wallet, retrieved from the pocket of the pants the medical team had cut away. Inside was a school ID, a library card, and exactly $7, likely his earnings from the morning's paper route. Richard held the security guard's stare when the man again glanced meaningfully at Max. "The dog stays with me, and whatever Jamal needs, any treatment, any specialist, I'm covering all of it, whatever it costs." The nurse looked up from her clipboard, one eyebrow raised slightly. "And again, sir, your relationship to the patient?" Richard Blackwell watched the medical team working on Jamal, noting the moment they secured an oxygen mask over the boy's face as his breathing became more labored. "No relation," he said firmly, "but I'm responsible for him now." Richard Blackwell watched the medical team working on Jamal, noting the moment they secured an oxygen mask over the boy's face as his breathing became more labored. "No relation," he said firmly, "but I'm responsible for him now." The nurse gave him a skeptical look but nodded, making notes on her clipboard. "You'll need to fill out these forms, sir, and the dog really can't—" "The dog stays," Richard interrupted, his tone leaving no room for argument. He took the clipboard and moved to a nearby chair, Max settling at his feet. The golden retriever's fur was still damp, but he seemed otherwise unaffected by his ordeal in the frozen lake, unlike the boy who had saved him. Through the windows of the trauma room, Richard watched as doctors moved with practiced efficiency around Jamal's still form. They had wrapped him in what looked like metallic blankets, and a doctor was carefully inserting an IV line. The boy's dark skin had taken on an ashen quality that made Richard's stomach tighten with worry. "Mr. Blackwell?" Another nurse approached, this one older and seemingly more senior. "Dr. Matthews would like a word when you have a moment." Richard quickly handed the partially completed forms back to the first nurse and followed the senior nurse to a consultation room adjacent to the trauma area. A middle-aged doctor with salt and pepper hair was studying a chart when they entered. "Mr. Blackwell, I'm Dr. Matthews," he said, extending his hand. "I understand you brought in our young patient?" "Yes," Richard explained the situation at the lake, watching the doctor's expression grow increasingly concerned. "His core temperature is dangerously low," Dr. Matthews explained. "We're using active rewarming techniques, but I'm concerned about his respiratory function. His chest sounds indicate significant constriction. Does he have any medical conditions you're aware of?" Richard reached into his pocket and produced the soaked papers he'd found in Jamal's jacket. "I believe he has asthma." These were in his pocket, prescriptions that appear unfilled. The doctor examined the soggy papers, his frown deepening. "These are for high-grade asthma medications, expensive ones. They're dated 3 weeks ago." He looked up at Richard. "The cold water immersion likely triggered a severe asthmatic response. We'll need to address both conditions simultaneously." "Do whatever is necessary," Richard said. "Cost is not an issue." Back in the waiting area, Richard instructed his driver, who had joined them, to return to his home and bring dry clothes for both himself and Max. As the driver departed, Richard sat heavily in a molded plastic chair, the events of the morning catching up with him. His cashmere suit was ruined, his Italian leather shoes squelched with every step. But all he could think about was the boy's unflinching courage as he pushed Max to safety while his own strength was failing. Richard pulled out his phone, now thankfully dry thanks to its waterproof case, and made a call. "Diane, I need you to find information on a family," he said when his executive assistant answered. "Williams, residing at Birchwood Apartments. The son's name is Jamal, approximately 13 years old. I need to know everything. Family situation, financial status, medical history if possible." He ended the call just as a commotion near the trauma room caught his attention. Jamal's body was convulsing slightly, his back arching off the bed as medical staff rushed to stabilize him. "He's seizing!" a nurse called out, her voice carrying through the partially open door. Richard stood, moving closer without entering, Max following closely at his heels. Through the window, he watched as Dr. Matthews administered medication through Jamal's IV, speaking calmly but urgently to his team. After what seemed like an eternity but was likely only a minute, Jamal's body relaxed, though his breathing still appeared labored, even with the oxygen mask. A young resident emerged from the room, looking surprised to find Richard standing there. "What happened?" Richard demanded. "The combination of hypothermia and oxygen deprivation can sometimes trigger seizures," the resident explained, his eyes flicking nervously to Max. "We've stabilized him for now, but we need to monitor him closely." "Will he be okay?" Richard asked, the question sounding hollow even to his own ears. "Dr. Matthews is optimistic, but the next few hours will be critical," the resident replied diplomatically. "Are you family?" "No," Richard answered, growing tired of the question. "I'm the reason he was in that lake." The resident looked confused but didn't press further, merely nodding before returning to the trauma room. Richard checked his watch. Nearly an hour had passed since the rescue, with still no word from Jamal's mother. He tried calling the number again, but once more reached voicemail. His driver returned with the requested items, and Richard gratefully changed into dry clothes in a hospital bathroom, using paper towels to dry his hair as best he could. He also toweled Max dry, the dog patiently allowing the attention. When Richard emerged, Dr. Matthews was waiting for him. "We're moving him to the pediatric ICU," the doctor informed him. His condition is stabilizing, but I'm concerned about potential complications. The hypothermia was severe, and combined with his untreated asthma. What complications? Richard asked sharply. Pneumonia is our primary concern, along with potential cardiac arrhythmias from the cold shock, Dr. Matthews explained. We're starting him on a regimen of bronchodilators for the asthma and prophylactic antibiotics to prevent infection. As they spoke, orderlies wheeled Jamal's bed past them toward the elevator. The boy was still unconscious, his face partially obscured by the oxygen mask, but some color had returned to his cheeks. I'd like to stay with him, Richard said, following the bed. Are you his guardian? Dr. Matthews asked. Richard's patience finally snapped. No, I am not his guardian. I am not related to him. But that boy nearly died saving my dog, and until his mother arrives, someone should be with him who actually gives a damn. The outburst left an uncomfortable silence in its wake. Dr. Matthews adjusted his glasses, then nodded. Third floor. Room 314 once they get him settled. But only you, the dog, will have to wait elsewhere. Richard glanced down at Max, who had remained exceptionally well-behaved throughout the ordeal. He's a certified therapy dog, Richard lied smoothly. He visits children's hospitals regularly. The doctor looked skeptical but didn't argue further. Fine, but if any staff complain, they won't, Richard assured him, already heading for the elevator. The pediatric ICU was quieter than the emergency room, with softer lighting and walls painted in gentle blues and greens. Nurses moved efficiently between rooms, their rubber-soled shoes barely making a sound on the polished floors. Richard followed the orderlies as they transferred Jamal to a bed in a private room, one of the nurses giving Max a disapproving glance but saying nothing. Once the medical staff had Jamal settled and left to attend to other patients, Richard pulled a chair close to the bed. Max curled up beneath it, resting his chin on his paws as if he understood the need to be inconspicuous. You're a brave kid, Jamal Williams, Richard said softly to the unconscious boy. Foolish perhaps, but brave. He studied Jamal more carefully now that they were alone. The boy was thin, not just naturally slender, but the kind of thinness that spoke of missed meals. His hands, resting on top of the hospital blanket, showed calluses and old scrapes, the hands of someone who worked hard despite his young age. The school ID Richard had found in his wallet listed Eastside Middle School, a public school in one of the city's struggling neighborhoods. A soft chime from Richard's phone interrupted his thoughts. It was a text from Diane with preliminary information on the Williams family. Jamal Williams, 12, lives with mother Tanya Williams, 34, single parent. Father left 4 years ago, whereabouts unknown. Mother works 2 jobs, day shift at Walmart, night cleaning at Meridian Towers, apartment in subsidized housing complex. Multiple ER visits for Jamal over past 2 years, all respiratory related. Mother's medical insurance is basic coverage through Walmart, high deductible. Richard frowned at the screen. The picture was becoming clearer, and it explained the unfilled prescriptions. High-grade asthma medications could run hundreds of dollars per month, even with insurance. For a single mother working 2 minimum-wage jobs. A soft groan from the bed snapped his attention back to Jamal. The boy's eyelids fluttered, then opened halfway, his gaze unfocused. Max? He mumbled through the oxygen mask, his voice barely audible. He's right here, Richard said, gesturing for the dog to stand where Jamal could see him. Thanks to you, he's perfectly fine. Max's tail wagged as he carefully approached the bed, sniffing gently at Jamal's hand. The boy managed a weak smile before his eyes drifted closed again. A nurse entered to check Jamal's vital signs, recording them in the electronic chart with brisk efficiency. She adjusted his IV fluid and checked the oxygen flow before turning to Richard. His temperature is coming up nicely, she reported, but his oxygen saturation is still lower than we'd like. The doctor has ordered an albuterol breathing treatment once he's more alert. After she left, Richard found himself unexpectedly emotional. He had built his fortune through shrewd business deals and strategic investments, cultivating an image of calculated detachment that served him well in boardrooms. Yet here he sat, deeply concerned about a boy he'd met only hours ago under the most extraordinary circumstances. The elevator at the end of the hall dinged, and a woman rushed out, still wearing a Walmart cashier's vest over a plain blouse. Her eyes were wide with panic as she approached the nurse's station, her voice carrying clearly. "My son, Jamal Williams. I was told he's here. I'm his mother, Tanya Williams." The nurse pointed toward Jamal's room, and the woman turned, freezing when she saw Richard standing in the doorway. Her expression shifted rapidly from relief to confusion to wariness as she approached. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice strained but controlled. "Where's my son?" "I'm Richard Blackwell," he replied, stepping aside so she could enter the room. "Your son saved my dog from drowning this morning." Tanya rushed past him to Jamal's bedside, her hand gently touching his forehead. The tenderness of the gesture made Richard look away, feeling suddenly like an intruder. "What happened?" Tanya asked, not taking her eyes off her son. "They just called me at work, said there was an accident." Richard explained the events at the lake, watching as Tanya's expression cycled through horror, pride, and finally settled on a weary concern that suggested this wasn't the first time her son's actions had frightened her. "That's Jamal," she said softly. "Always trying to help. Never thinking about himself first." She finally looked up at Richard, taking in his obviously expensive clothes, then at Max, sitting obediently, nearby. "Your dog?" "Yes, Max." Richard cleared his throat. "Your son showed extraordinary courage." Tanya nodded, her hand still resting on Jamal's. "I need to speak with the doctors about his treatment and the costs." Her voice faltered slightly on the last word. "I've taken care of that," Richard said quickly. "All expenses. Everything he needs." Tanya's back stiffened, her eyes narrowing slightly. "That's not necessary. We have insurance." "I insist," Richard said firmly. "It's the least I can do." When the nurse returned with the doctor to assess Jamal's improved condition, she found Richard examining the wet prescription papers, now consciously aware of the high-priced asthma medication that had obviously been financially out of reach for this family. In the pocket of Jamal's cheap, worn jacket, he had found not only paper route receipts, but also unfilled prescriptions for expensive asthma medications that the family clearly couldn't afford. When the nurse returned with the doctor to assess Jamal's improved condition, she found Richard examining the wet prescription papers, now consciously aware of the high-priced asthma medication that had obviously been financially out of reach for this family. In the pocket of Jamal's cheap, worn jacket, he had found not only paper route receipts, but also unfilled prescriptions for expensive asthma medications that the family clearly couldn't afford. Dr. Matthews approached Tanya, extending his hand with a warm smile. "Mrs. Williams, I'm Dr. Matthews. I've been overseeing your son's treatment." Tanya shook his hand firmly, though Richard noticed how her other hand never left Jamal's. "How is he, doctor? Will he be all right?" "Jamal's showing good signs of recovery from the hypothermia," Dr. Matthews explained, checking the monitors beside the bed. "His core temperature has stabilized, which is excellent news. However, I'm concerned about his respiratory function. His records indicate several previous ER visits for asthma." "Attacks?" Tanya nodded, her expression a mixture of concern and embarrassment. "Yes, he's had asthma since he was 4. Usually we manage it with his rescue inhaler, but it's been getting worse this winter." Dr. Matthews glanced at the soggy prescription papers Richard had placed on the bedside table. "I see he was prescribed Advair and Singulair 3 weeks ago, but these don't appear to have been filled." Richard watched as Tanya's shoulders tensed. Her voice, when she spoke, was deliberately measured. "Our insurance has a high deductible. I've been saving to get them filled next week after I get paid." The doctor nodded without judgment. I understand. For now, we've started him on IV steroids and bronchodilators to open his airways. We'll transition to nebulizer treatments once he's more alert. He hesitated before adding, Mrs. Williams, given his history and the severity of today's attack, I strongly recommend maintaining a consistent regimen with controller medications going forward. I know what he needs, Doctor, Tanya replied, a hint of defensiveness creeping into her voice. All of Jamal's medications and treatments are covered, Richard interjected smoothly. And any prescriptions he needs after discharge. Tanya turned toward him, her expression hardening slightly. Mr. Blackwell, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but... Mrs. Williams, Richard continued, his tone gentle but firm, your son saved something irreplaceable to me. Please allow me to express my gratitude in a meaningful way. Before Tanya could respond, Jamal stirred on the bed, his eyelids fluttering open. Mom, he murmured through the oxygen mask, his voice weak but clear. Tanya immediately turned her full attention to her son, all other concerns momentarily forgotten. I'm here, baby. You're going to be fine. Jamal's eyes focused slowly, taking in his surroundings with confusion before settling on Max, who had moved closer to the bed. A small smile formed beneath the oxygen mask. Hey, buddy, he whispered. You okay? Richard watched as the golden retriever's tail wagged gently, the animal seemingly understanding the need for calm behavior. The simple interaction between boy and dog created a lump in his throat that he couldn't quite explain. Dr. Matthews checked Jamal's pupils with a small penlight. Welcome back, young man. You gave us quite a scare. How are you feeling? Cold, Jamal replied, then his brow furrowed. My chest hurts. Hard to breathe. That's your asthma acting up from the cold water, the doctor explained. We're giving you medicine to help. I need you to take slow, deep breaths if you can. As the doctor continued his examination, Richard stepped back toward the door, suddenly feeling like an intruder in this family moment. I should give you some privacy, he said quietly. Max and I will be in the waiting area if you need anything. Tanya looked up, her expression softening slightly. Mr. Blackwell, she called as he reached the door. Thank you for getting him here so quickly. Richard nodded once before slipping out with Max at his heels. In the waiting area, Richard made several calls, first to his office to reschedule the day's meetings, then to his housekeeper to arrange for special care for Max when they returned home. Finally, he called Diane again for an update on her research. The situation is about what we expected, his assistant reported. Ms. Williams has been the sole provider since her husband left. She works over 60 hours a week between both jobs. There are multiple late notices on utilities in their file. And according to school records, Jamal qualifies for free lunch and frequently stays late at the library since his mother doesn't get home until after her night shift ends. Richard rubbed his temples, processing this information. And the medical situation? 3 ER visits in the past year alone, all for severe asthma attacks. Their insurance has a $5,000 deductible, which resets each January. Based on the timing of the unfilled prescriptions, they were likely waiting for tax refunds to cover medication costs. Thank you, Diane. Please have legal draw-up papers for a medical trust that would cover all of Jamal's healthcare needs going forward and research options for educational scholarships as well. I want preliminary documents by tomorrow. Of course, sir. And the press office has received several inquiries about the incident at the lake. Someone posted a photo on social media of you carrying the boy to your car. How would you like us to respond? Richard frowned. He hadn't noticed anyone taking pictures. No comment at this time. Redirect any questions to our standard charitable giving statement. 2 hours later, Richard returned to Jamal's room to find the boy sitting up in bed, still connected to monitors but with a nebulizer mask replacing the oxygen. Tanya sat beside him, both of them looking up when Richard entered with Max. "How are you feeling?" Richard asked, noting with relief that Jamal's color had improved significantly. "Better," Jamal replied, his voice stronger though still raspy. "They say I can probably go home tomorrow if my breathing keeps improving." "That's excellent news," Richard said, allowing Max to approach the bed where Jamal eagerly reached out to stroke the dog's golden fur. Tanya stood, smoothing her Walmart uniform nervously. "Mr. Blackwell, could I speak with you in the hallway for a moment?" Outside the room, Tanya crossed her arms, her posture both defensive and determined. "I need to make something clear. I'm deeply grateful that you helped my son today, but I can't accept ongoing financial assistance." Richard studied her carefully. Tanya Williams was perhaps 15 years his junior, with the same warm brown eyes as her son, though hers held a wariness born of difficult experience. Despite her obvious exhaustion, she stood tall, chin slightly raised. "Mrs. Williams." "Tanya, please." "Tanya," Richard amended, "your son displayed extraordinary courage today. The kind that deserves recognition." "Jamal doesn't do good things expecting rewards," she replied firmly. "That's not how I raised him." Richard nodded, recognizing the pride in her voice. "Of course not. But surely you understand my desire to help ensure his health and future?" Tanya's expression softened slightly. "I understand that you're grateful and you seem like a good man, Mr. Blackwell. But accepting your charity would send the wrong message to Jamal about self-reliance. We've managed on our own since his father left, and will continue to do so." Before Richard could respond, a commotion at the end of the hallway caught their attention. A man with a professional camera and a woman holding a microphone were arguing with a security guard. "I'm telling you, Richard Blackwell is here," the woman insisted loudly. "We have reliable information that he rescued a child this morning." The security guard blocked their path. "This is a hospital, not a press conference. You need to leave." The reporter spotted Richard and called out, "Mr. Blackwell, Rebecca Winters, Channel 8 News. Is it true you jumped into Henderson Lake to save a child?" Richard stepped in front of Tanya protectively, his expression darkening. "That's completely inaccurate," he stated firmly. "And you're disturbing patients. This is inappropriate." "Just a few questions," the reporter persisted, trying to maneuver around the security guard. "Our viewers would love to hear about your heroic rescue." "There was nothing heroic about my actions," Richard replied coldly. "Now please leave, before I have you removed." The security guard finally managed to usher the news crew toward the elevator, but not before the cameraman snapped several photos of Richard and Tanya. "I apologize for that," Richard said once they were gone. "Someone posted pictures from this morning online. It seems the story is spreading." Tanya's brow furrowed with concern. "Jamal doesn't need that kind of attention. He's already shy enough at school." "I'll have my team handle it," Richard assured her. "They can issue a statement requesting privacy." They returned to Jamal's room to find him dozing, the nebulizer treatment complete. Max had somehow managed to position himself partially on the bed, his head resting gently against Jamal's leg. The sight caused both adults to pause in the doorway. "He's never been that comfortable with strangers," Richard commented quietly. "Max is usually reserved until he knows someone well." Tanya smiled faintly. "Jamal has always had a way with animals. He checks out veterinary books from the library every week. Says he's going to be a vet someday." "An admirable goal," Richard replied, watching as Jamal's hand unconsciously settled on Max's head in his sleep. A nurse entered to check Jamal's vitals, smiling at the sight of the boy and dog. "His oxygen levels are much improved," she reported quietly. "Dr. Matthews has ordered dinner for him. Would you like me to bring something for you as well?" she asked Tanya. "No, thank you," Tanya replied, glancing at her watch with a frown. "Actually, I should call my evening job and let them know I won't be in tonight." "I took the liberty of contacting both your employers," Richard said. Walmart has approved paid emergency leave for the rest of the week, and the cleaning service understands you won't be available. Tanya's expression tightened. You had no right to do that without asking me first. You're right, Richard acknowledged, realizing his overreach. I apologize. I'm accustomed to solving problems directly. She studied him for a moment before her expression softened slightly. You're used to being in charge, aren't you, Mr. Blackwell? Richard, please, he corrected. And yes, I suppose I am. Their conversation was interrupted when Jamal awoke, blinking sleepily at them. Mom, are you going to work soon? The concern in his young voice was so adult, so used to his mother's constant departures for work, that Richard felt something twist in his chest. Before he could stop himself, he said, Your mom's staying with you tonight, Jamal, and I've brought something else that might help you feel better. He motioned for his driver, who had been waiting in the hallway, to enter. The man carried a large gift bag, which he handed to Richard before quietly departing. This isn't necessary, Tanya began, but Richard was already removing a brand new tablet from the bag. I thought you might get bored in the hospital, he explained to Jamal, whose eyes had widened. It's loaded with books on veterinary medicine, and some games too. The nurse said it was okay as long as you use headphones during quiet hours. Really? Jamal whispered, accepting the device with careful hands. I can keep it? Of course, Richard replied, pleased by the boy's reaction. As Jamal explored the tablet with growing excitement, a soft chime came from Richard's phone. He checked it to find a news alert with his name in the headline. Opening the link revealed the local news website already running a story. Billionaire's dog rescued by local hero teen. The article included a grainy photo of Richard carrying Jamal to his car and quoted sources at Mercy General Hospital, describing Jamal as the son of a single mother from the struggling East Side neighborhood. Richard showed the article to Tanya, whose face fell as she read. This isn't going to blow over, is it? She asked quietly, watching her son, who remained blissfully unaware of the media interest, absorbed in his new tablet. I'm afraid not, Richard admitted. My company has been in the news recently due to a controversial development project. The media loves nothing more than a human interest angle involving someone in my position. Tanya sighed, the weariness of the day finally showing in the slump of her shoulders. Jamal already has enough challenges. He doesn't need to be known as the poor boy who saved a rich man's dog. The next morning, Tanya found the local newspaper with a sensational headline. Poor boy risks life for billionaire's dog, accompanied by an unauthorized photo of Jamal in the hospital bed and insinuations about the suspicious generosity of the businessman. Tanya stared at the newspaper headline in disbelief, her hands trembling slightly as she read the sensationalized article about her son. The photo of Jamal in his hospital bed, clearly taken without permission, made her stomach churn with anger and violation. She quickly folded the paper before Jamal could see it, tucking it beneath her purse on the windowsill. Everything okay, Mom? Jamal asked from the bed, where he was already sitting up and exploring his new tablet, Max curled contentedly at his feet. Just fine, baby, she assured him with a forced smile. How are you feeling this morning? Before Jamal could answer, Richard appeared in the doorway, his expression grim. He carried a cardboard tray with 3 cups of coffee and a small paper bag. His eyes immediately went to the folded newspaper, and Tanya knew he had already seen the article. Good morning, he said, setting the tray on the bedside table. I brought breakfast. The nurse said Jamal can have solid food now, so I got some muffins from the cafe downstairs. Thank you, Tanya replied, her tone more reserved than the previous evening. She accepted the coffee gratefully, however, having spent a restless night in the uncomfortable recliner beside Jamal's bed. Richard gestured subtly toward the hallway, and Tanya nodded, telling Jamal she'd be right back. Once they were outside the room, Richard ran a hand through his hair in frustration. "I've already called the newspaper editor," he said quietly. "They've agreed to retract the online version of the story and issue an apology. But obviously the print edition is already circulating." "How did they get his photo?" Tanya asked, her voice tight with controlled anger. "Someone on the hospital staff, most likely," Richard replied. "I've spoken with administration about it, and they're launching an internal investigation. I'm sorry, Tanya. This isn't what either of you deserve after what Jamal did." Tanya sighed, leaning against the wall. "What happens now?" "My PR team will issue a statement requesting privacy, but honestly, the best approach might be to give them something, a controlled interview or statement that satisfies their curiosity without exploiting Jamal." They were interrupted by Dr. Matthews approaching with a tablet in hand, reviewing Jamal's latest test results. "Good news," he announced. "Jamal's breathing has improved significantly overnight. If this trend continues, I'm comfortable discharging him this afternoon, provided he continues his medication regimen strictly." "That's wonderful," Tanya said, genuine relief washing over her tired features. "I'd like to schedule a follow-up with our pulmonology department next week," the doctor continued, "and I've prepared prescriptions for his discharge medications." He hesitated, glancing between Tanya and Richard. "They're specialized asthma controllers that should prevent future attacks, but they are expensive." "All covered," Richard said firmly before Tanya could speak. "I've arranged everything with the hospital pharmacy." Dr. Matthews nodded, seemingly unsurprised by the arrangement. "Excellent. I'll prepare the discharge papers for later today." When they returned to the room, Jamal had set aside his tablet and was softly talking to Max, who listened with attentive ears and occasional tail wags. The scene was so natural and comfortable that both adults paused in the doorway, reluctant to interrupt. "Did you know golden retrievers were originally bred to retrieve waterfowl for hunters?" Jamal was explaining to the dog. "That's why you're such a good swimmer. It's in your DNA." "He certainly seems to know his animal facts," Richard commented quietly to Tanya. "He reads everything he can get his hands on about animals," she replied with a proud smile. "His science teacher says he knows more about animal anatomy than most high school students." Richard watched the interaction thoughtfully. "There's a veterinary program for middle schoolers at the Natural Science Museum," he mentioned. "Weekend workshops with actual veterinarians. Max participates as a demo animal sometimes." Tanya's smile faded slightly. "That sounds wonderful, but those programs are usually expensive." "This one offers scholarships," Richard replied. "Based on interest and aptitude, not financial need. Jamal would certainly qualify." They entered the room fully then, and Jamal looked up, with a brightness in his eyes that had been absent the day before. "Max was telling me he wants a treat," he announced, with a mischievous grin. "Was he now?" Richard laughed, reaching into his pocket for a small dog biscuit he'd brought along. "Quite the communicator, isn't he?" As Jamal fed the treat to Max, Richard settled into the visitor's chair, watching the boy with growing curiosity. "Jamal, your mother tells me you're interested in becoming a veterinarian someday." "Yes, sir," Jamal replied earnestly. "Since I was 7. What made you decide that's what you wanted to do?" Jamal's expression grew more serious, his hands still gently stroking Max's golden fur. "There was this stray cat in our old neighborhood. It got hit by a car, and nobody would help it. I tried, but I didn't know how." His voice grew quieter. "It died, and I promised myself I'd learn how to help animals so that wouldn't happen again." The simple, heartfelt explanation hung in the air for a moment. Richard felt an unexpected tightness in his throat, reminded suddenly of his daughter's similar compassion. Tanya moved closer to her son, resting a hand on his shoulder with quiet pride. "That's a noble goal," Richard finally said. "And a community needs good veterinarians just as much as good doctors." Before Jamal could respond, a soft knock at the door announced the arrival of a nurse with his morning medications. As she administered the treatment, Richard took the opportunity to check his phone, frowning at several missed calls from his office. "I need to step out and handle a few things," he apologized. "Max can stay if you'd like the company, Jamal." "Really?" the boy asked, his face lighting up. "He can stay with me?" "Of course. He seems quite comfortable with you." In the hospital corridor, Richard returned his most urgent calls, speaking quietly but firmly with his PR director about managing the growing media interest in the story. Just as he was finishing, he noticed a familiar figure stepping off the elevator, his personal assistant, Diane, carrying a large portfolio and a garment bag. "I brought the documents you requested," she said efficiently, handing him the portfolio. "And a change of clothes. Your calendar has been cleared through tomorrow, and I've rescheduled the board meeting for next week." "Thank you, Diane. What's the status on the medical trust?" "Legal has drafted the preliminary paperwork," she replied, opening the portfolio to show him. "It's structured to cover all healthcare costs for Jamal Williams until he turns 25, with provisions for educational expenses related to his medical condition." Richard reviewed the documents, nodding with satisfaction. "And the educational options?" "I've researched several scholarship opportunities," Diane continued, flipping to another section. "The most promising is through the Westridge Academy. They have an exceptional science program and a partnership with the University Veterinary School for mentoring gifted students." "Westridge is expensive," Richard noted, thinking aloud. "Even with a partial scholarship, there would be significant costs." "Which is why I've also prepared documentation for an educational trust," Diane replied smoothly. "It could be structured as a merit scholarship, with no direct connection to you, if that's your preference." Richard considered this, remembering Tanya's fierce pride and resistance to charity. "Let's hold off on that for now. Focus on the medical trust and the more immediate needs." As Diane departed, Richard turned to head back to Jamal's room, but paused when he heard raised voices from inside. Moving closer, he recognized one as belonging to the reporter who had tried to ambush them the previous day. "It's just a few questions," the woman was saying. "People are inspired by your son's bravery. Don't you want his story told properly?" "What I want," Tanya's voice replied firmly, "is for my son to recover in peace. Please leave." Richard entered the room to find Rebecca Winters, the Channel 8 reporter, standing at the foot of Jamal's bed with a small recorder in hand. Tanya stood protectively between the reporter and her son, while Max had positioned himself beside Jamal, his usual friendly demeanor replaced by alert watchfulness. "Ms. Winters," Richard said coldly, "I believe you were asked to leave." The reporter turned, a practiced smile immediately replacing her frustrated expression. "Mr. Blackwell, perfect timing. I was just explaining to Mrs. Williams how beneficial a human interest story could be. Your company has faced some negative press lately over the Riverside Development Project. This heartwarming rescue story could really—" "Stop," Richard interrupted, his voice low but commanding. "You're attempting to exploit a child's medical situation for ratings, and you're trespassing in a private hospital room. Leave now, or I'll have security escort you out and file a harassment complaint." The reporter's smile faltered, her eyes darting between Richard and Tanya. "The public has a right to know. The public has no rights whatsoever when it comes to this child," Richard stated flatly. He moved to the door and held it open, his expression leaving no room for argument. After the reporter reluctantly departed, tension visibly drained from Tanya's shoulders. "Thank you," she said quietly. She just walked in like she had every right to be here. "I'll speak with security about restricting visitors," Richard assured her, then turned his attention to Jamal. "Are you all right?" Jamal nodded, though he looked unsettled by the confrontation. "She wanted to take pictures of me with Max." "Well, that's not happening," Tanya said firmly, sitting on the edge of her son's bed. Your job right now is just to get better. Richard watched the interaction between mother and son, struck again by their close bond, despite the challenges they clearly faced. The fierce protectiveness Tanya displayed reminded him of how he'd felt about his own daughter during her illness. The desperate need to shield her from anything that might cause additional pain or stress. Later that afternoon, as Jamal was being prepared for discharge, Richard returned from a brief trip to his home. He carried a small duffel bag, which he placed on the foot of Jamal's bed. "What's this?" the boy asked curiously. "Just a few things that might help with your recovery," Richard replied casually. "Books about veterinary medicine from my library, a new inhaler case that's waterproof, and some dog treats if you want Max to visit you at home." Jamal's face lit up as he explored the contents, particularly a thick, illustrated encyclopedia of animal medicine that looked nearly new. "This is amazing. Thank you, Mr. Blackwell." As the boy examined his gifts, Richard moved closer to Tanya, speaking in a quiet voice. "There's also information about that weekend veterinary program I mentioned. The spring session starts in 2 weeks, and the application deadline is still open." Tanya started to give her usual protest about costs, but Richard gently interrupted. "It's not charity, Tanya. It's recognition of genuine talent and interest. Jamal deserves the opportunity to pursue his passion." Before she could respond, Dr. Matthews arrived with discharge papers and final instructions. As the doctor reviewed the medication schedule with Tanya, Richard noticed a framed photo that had fallen partially out of her purse. A younger Tanya with Jamal as a toddler, and a man Richard assumed was Jamal's father. They looked happy, unaware of the challenges that lay ahead for the family. With a sudden soft noise, Richard turned to find Max had placed his head on Jamal's lap, and the boy had fallen asleep, with his hand still resting on the dog's fur, the children's veterinary book open beside him. The simple scene affected Richard profoundly. It reminded him painfully of similar moments with his daughter Emily, who had also found comfort in Max's presence during her long stays in the hospital oncology ward. "She was a lot like him," Richard said quietly, almost to himself. Tanya looked up from the paperwork, following his gaze to Jamal and Max. "Who was?" Richard hesitated, the words catching in his throat before he finally said, "My daughter Emily. She passed away 3 years ago after a long battle with leukemia." Tanya stared at Richard, momentarily forgetting the discharge papers in her hands. The revelation about his daughter hung in the air between them, suddenly explaining so much about his interest in Jamal. Before she could formulate a response, Dr. Matthews cleared his throat gently, bringing her attention back to the medical instructions. "Mrs. Williams, make sure Jamal takes these medications exactly as prescribed," the doctor continued. "The controller inhaler is twice daily, regardless of symptoms. The rescue inhaler is only for emergencies." Tanya nodded, forcing herself to focus on the doctor's words while processing what Richard had just shared. When the doctor finished and left them alone, she turned back to Richard, who was still watching Jamal sleep. "I'm so sorry about your daughter," she said softly. Richard nodded without looking away from the boy. "Emily was 12 when she died, same age as Jamal." His voice was steady but carried an undercurrent of pain that 3 years had failed to diminish. "Max was originally trained as her therapy dog. He visited her regularly during treatments." This new context made Richard's extraordinary generosity toward Jamal both more understandable and more complicated. Tanya felt a surge of empathy for the man, recognizing the haunted look in his eyes that only a parent who has faced their child's mortality could understand. "Mr. Blackwell, Richard," she amended, "I appreciate everything you've done for Jamal, truly. But I need to ask, is that why you're helping us? Because Jamal reminds you of Emily?" Richard finally turned to meet her gaze. "Perhaps partly," he admitted, "but it's more than that. Your son showed remarkable courage and selflessness. Those qualities deserve recognition, regardless of any personal connections I might feel." A week later, Jamal stood at the entrance to Franklin Middle School, clutching the straps of his backpack nervously. The familiar brick building looked somehow different after his hospital stay, or perhaps he was the one who had changed. Students streamed past him, many glancing his way with obvious curiosity. "You sure you're ready for this?" Tanya asked, standing beside him in her Walmart uniform, having arranged a late start to her shift so she could accompany him on his first day back. "I'm fine, Mom," Jamal assured her, though his tight grip on his backpack betrayed his anxiety. "The doctor said I'm good to return to normal activities." "Just take it easy in gym class," she reminded him. "And you have your inhaler?" Jamal patted his pocket, nodding. The new waterproof case Richard had given him was clipped securely inside. "I'll call you if I need anything." With a final hug that Jamal pretended to resist, though he secretly welcomed it, Tanya watched him walk into the school before hurrying to catch her bus to work. She'd lost her night cleaning job, despite Richard's intervention. The company had already hired a replacement during her absence, but her manager at Walmart had been unexpectedly understanding, even offering her additional daytime hours to compensate. Inside, Jamal made his way to his locker, keeping his head down as conversations hushed when he passed. He could feel eyes following him, and snippets of whispers reached his ears. "That's him, the one from the news. Jumped in a frozen lake. Some billionaire's dog." By the time he reached his first class, Jamal's shoulders were tight with tension. He slid into his usual seat near the back, hoping to avoid attention, but Mr. Peterson, his science teacher, immediately spotted him. "Jamal, welcome back," he announced loudly, drawing every eye in the room. "We're all very proud of your heroic actions last week." The entire class turned to stare at him, and Jamal felt his cheeks burn. "Thank you," he mumbled, wishing he could disappear into his chair. "In fact," Mr. Peterson continued enthusiastically, "I thought we might use your experience as inspiration for our lesson today on hypothermia and the body's response to extreme cold." Jamal's heart sank as Mr. Peterson launched into a detailed explanation of what happens physiologically when a person is submerged in freezing water, using Jamal's brave rescue as the central example. By the time the bell rang, Jamal felt as though his entire ordeal had been turned into a science experiment for public consumption. The rest of the morning followed a similar pattern. In English, Ms. Abernathy suggested he write an essay about his life-changing experience for the school newspaper. In history, Mr. Collins somehow connected Jamal's actions to Civil War-era heroism. By lunchtime, Jamal was exhausted from the unwanted attention. In the cafeteria, he found his usual corner table occupied by a group of 8th graders he didn't know well. As he hesitated with his tray, one of them called out, "Hey, Lake Boy, come sit with us." Reluctantly, Jamal joined them, immediately bombarded with questions about Richard Blackwell. "Is it true he's worth like billions?" one boy asked. "Did he give you money for saving his dog?" another questioned. "My mom says she saw you on the news," a girl with braces chimed in. "She said you live in those apartments on East Maple, the really run-down ones." Jamal picked at his food, answering minimally and wishing for his usual solitude. When his phone buzzed with a text from his mom checking on him, he used it as an excuse to escape to the library for the remainder of lunch period. The library had always been his sanctuary, but today even that felt different. Ms. Garcia, the librarian who normally respected his quiet nature, greeted him with unusual enthusiasm. "Jamal, I saved the newest veterinary journal for you," she said, producing a glossy magazine from behind her desk. "And I printed some information about that veterinary camp at the Natural Science Museum that Mr. Blackwell mentioned when he called." "Mr. Blackwell called the school?" Jamal asked, surprised and somewhat dismayed. "Oh yes, he spoke with Principal Winters about your academic interests," Ms. Garcia explained. He was very complimentary about your knowledge of animal medicine. Jamal accepted the materials with mixed feelings. While he was genuinely excited about the veterinary program, the idea that Richard had been discussing him with school administrators made him uncomfortable. It seemed his life was no longer entirely his own. During his final class of the day, Jamal's chest began to feel tight, a familiar precursor to breathing difficulties. He discreetly used his inhaler, but the whispers and stares had taken their toll, and he found himself counting the minutes until dismissal. When the final bell rang, he hurried to his locker, only to find Marcus Riley and his friends waiting nearby. Marcus, a 8th grader known for targeting smaller kids, leaned against the metal doors with a smirk. "Well, if it isn't Blackwell's charity case," Marcus drawled loudly enough for nearby students to hear. "Must be nice having a rich guy feel sorry for you." Jamal focused on his combination lock, trying to ignore the jibe. "I need to get my books," he said quietly. "What's the matter? Can't hear me over the sound of your fancy new phone?" Marcus reached out and plucked Jamal's phone from his pocket, the same model he'd had for years, but Marcus didn't seem to care about accuracy. "Bet Blackwell bought you all kinds of stuff for jumping in after his precious dog." Jamal felt his breathing quicken, anger mixing with anxiety. "Give it back," he said, his voice stronger than he expected. Something in his tone made Marcus hesitate, but the older boy quickly recovered, holding the phone higher. "Or what? You'll set your billionaire buddy on me?" Before Jamal could respond, a teacher rounded the corner and Marcus quickly shoved the phone back at him. "This isn't over, charity case," he muttered, before sauntering away with his friends. By the time Jamal reached home, his head was pounding, and his chest felt constricted despite using his inhaler twice more. The apartment was empty. His mother wouldn't be home for several more hours, and the silence was a welcome relief after the day's constant attention. He dropped his backpack on the small kitchen table and went to get a glass of water, only to notice a letter that had been slipped under their door. Opening it, he found an eviction notice stating they were 2 months behind on rent, with a handwritten note explaining that his mother's request for an extension had been denied due to her unreliable work attendance. Jamal sank into a chair, the paper trembling in his hands. His mother had missed work to stay with him in the hospital, and now they were going to lose their home because of it. The unfairness of it burned in his chest, mixing with the increasingly familiar sensation of his airways constricting. He reached for his inhaler again, the 3rd time that day, more than he'd needed in weeks. Later that evening, Tanya returned home to find Jamal hunched over his homework at the kitchen table, his face drawn and pale. She immediately noticed the change in his breathing, the slight wheeze that signaled his asthma was flaring up again. "Tough day?" she asked gently, setting down her purse and noticing the eviction notice beside his textbook. Jamal nodded without looking up. "Everyone at school was weird. The teachers kept using me as an example, and some 8th graders were saying stuff about us being charity cases." He finally met her eyes. "And then I found that." Tanya picked up the notice, her expression carefully neutral despite the panic it triggered. "Don't worry about this. I'll handle it." "It's because you missed work for me, isn't it?" Jamal persisted. "If I hadn't jumped in that lake—" "Stop right there," Tanya interrupted firmly. "You did a brave, selfless thing. None of this is your fault." Before Jamal could respond, there was a knock at their door. Tanya opened it to reveal Richard Blackwell, looking somewhat out of place in the hallway of their apartment building in his tailored suit. "I hope I'm not interrupting," he said, glancing past her to where Jamal sat at the table. "I wanted to check how Jamal's first day back at school went." Tanya invited him in, watching as Richard immediately noted Jamal's labored breathing and the eviction notice on the table. His eyes narrowed slightly as he took in the sparse furnishings of their small apartment and the visible draft from the poorly sealed windows. "Jamal, you don't look well," Richard observed, concern evident in his voice. Is your asthma bothering you again? Jamal nodded reluctantly. Just a little. It's been a long day. Richard's gaze shifted to the eviction notice. May I? He asked Tanya, who nodded tiredly. After reading it, he sat down at the table across from Jamal, his expression thoughtful. I have a proposition for both of you, he said finally, one that I think might solve several problems at once. He reached into his briefcase and withdrew a folder containing brochures and several official-looking documents. This is information about Westridge Academy, one of the top private schools in the city. They have an exceptional science program and a specialized track for students interested in veterinary medicine. Jamal's eyes widened as he looked at the glossy brochure showing modern science labs and students working with animals. Westridge is excited about the possibility of having Jamal join them on a full merit scholarship, Richard continued. And Tanya, my foundation has an administrative position open that I believe would be perfect for your organizational skills. It offers flexible hours and comprehensive benefits, including housing assistance. Tanya stared at him, momentarily speechless at the magnitude of what he was offering. Richard, this is too much. It's not charity, he said, anticipating her objection. The scholarship is based on Jamal's academic potential, which his teachers confirm is exceptional. And the job is a genuine need within my organization, one that your experience qualifies you for. As Richard outlined the details, Jamal found himself torn between excitement at the opportunities described in the brochures and anxiety about entering such a different world. The pristine uniforms and manicured campus of Westridge Academy seemed a universe away from his current school, with its metal detectors and overcrowded classrooms. Can I think about it? He asked quietly when Richard finished explaining. Of course, Richard replied, surprise evident in his voice. I thought you'd be excited about the science facilities and veterinary program. I am, Jamal assured him, his fingers tracing the outline of an advanced laboratory pictured in the brochure. It's just a lot of change. Later that night, after Richard had left with promises to give them time to consider his offer, Jamal lay in bed staring at the ceiling. Through the thin walls, he could hear his mother on the phone, trying to negotiate with their landlord. The conversation wasn't going well, judging by the tension in her voice. The Westridge brochure lay open on his bedside table, the smiling students in their crisp uniforms looking back at him. Jamal tried to imagine himself among them, in the state-of-the-art laboratories, finally having access to the resources to pursue his dream of becoming a veterinarian. But Marcus's taunts echoed in his mind. Blackwell's charity case. Would that follow him to Westridge too? Would he forever be known as the poor kid who jumped in a lake and caught a rich man's attention? On the morning of his first day at Westridge Academy, Jamal nervously adjusted the tie of his new uniform while observing the luxury cars dropping off students, and whispered to himself, "Just be yourself. You saved a dog from a frozen lake. How can this be any harder than that?" Jamal stepped through the imposing iron gates of Westridge Academy, his new backpack, feeling unnaturally light without the weight of his usual textbooks. Everything about the campus intimidated him, from the manicured lawns to the historic brick buildings that looked more like a college than a middle school. Students streamed past him in identical uniforms, their confident strides and easy laughter highlighting how much of an outsider he was. Taking a deep breath to steady his nerves, Jamal followed the directions on the visitor map toward the administration building. His new loafers, still stiff and uncomfortable, clicked against the cobblestone pathway as he walked. He'd woken up 2 hours early that morning to make sure everything was perfect. His shirt, precisely tucked, his tie properly knotted according to the instruction sheet, his hair neatly trimmed the day before at a salon Richard had recommended. Inside the administration building, a receptionist with a pearl necklace and immaculate blonde bob looked up from her computer. "May I help you?" she asked, her voice carrying the practiced warmth of someone accustomed to greeting important visitors. "I'm Jamal Williams," he replied, his voice coming out quieter than intended. "Today's my first day." Recognition flashed across her face. "Oh yes, Mr. Williams. We've been expecting you." She reached for a folder on her desk. "The Blackwell Scholar, correct?" The label made Jamal's stomach tighten. Just 2 weeks ago, he'd been an ordinary student at Franklin Middle School. Now he was the Blackwell Scholar, a title that would announce his connection to Richard before he could even introduce himself. "Yes, ma'am," he replied, accepting the folder she handed him. "This contains your class schedule, campus map, and locker assignment," she explained, her smile never wavering. "Principal Hammond asked me to tell you he's looking forward to meeting you at lunch today." As she spoke, a quick buzz came from her phone. "Oh, and Mr. Blackwell called this morning to check that you arrived safely. Isn't that thoughtful?" Jamal nodded mechanically, wondering if every staff member knew about Richard's personal interest in him. The receptionist directed him to his first class, advanced biology, and Jamal thanked her before heading back into the hallway, now bustling with students rushing to their morning classes. Following his map, Jamal navigated the unfamiliar corridors, aware of curious glances from passing students. The science wing was housed in a newer addition to the campus, a gleaming structure of glass and steel that contrasted with the traditional architecture of the main buildings. Inside, the laboratory classroom looked nothing like the outdated science rooms at Franklin. Pristine lab tables with polished granite tops were arranged in pairs, each equipped with modern microscopes and tablets mounted on stands. A few students were already seated when Jamal entered, their conversations pausing momentarily as they noticed him. The teacher, a woman with close-cropped gray hair and wire-rimmed glasses, approached him immediately. "You must be Jamal," she said, extending her hand. "I'm Dr. Leibowitz. We're delighted to have you join us." "Thank you," Jamal replied, shaking her hand and trying to project confidence he didn't feel. "I've read your transcripts from Franklin," she continued. "Your science scores are impressive, especially given the limited resources. I think you'll find our facilities more conducive to your interests in biological sciences." Before Jamal could respond, Dr. Leibowitz addressed the class, which had now filled with students. "Everyone, this is Jamal Williams, who's joining us on the prestigious Blackwell Scholarship. Jamal has a particular interest in veterinary medicine, which will be an asset during our upcoming unit on comparative anatomy." 20 pairs of eyes turned to assess him, and Jamal fought the urge to shrink under their collective gaze. Dr. Leibowitz directed him to an empty seat next to a girl with dark hair pulled into a neat ponytail, who offered him a small smile as he sat down. The class itself was both exhilarating and overwhelming. Dr. Leibowitz moved at a pace that assumed considerable background knowledge, referencing concepts Jamal had only read about in his library books. Yet, when they began the hands-on portion, examining tissue samples under microscopes, Jamal found himself in familiar territory. His hours spent studying veterinary textbooks had given him an eye for cellular structures that even his new classmates seemed to lack. "That's a perfect example of epithelial tissue," Dr. Leibowitz remarked, peering over his shoulder at his microscope. "Excellent identification, Jamal." The girl beside him leaned closer. "Nice work," she whispered. "I'm Maya Chen, by the way." "Thanks," Jamal replied, relieved by the friendly overture. "This is all pretty new to me." "You'll catch on quick," Maya assured him. "Dr. L seems impressed already, and trust me, that doesn't happen often." As they packed up at the end of class, Maya asked casually, "Where are you headed next?" Jamal consulted his schedule. "World history with Mr. Harrington." "Same," Maya said, shouldering her backpack. "I'll show you the way." Walking alongside Maya through the crowded hallway, Jamal felt slightly less out of place. "So you're on scholarship too?" he asked, remembering how the receptionist had labeled him. Maya nodded. "Academic scholarship, yeah. My parents own a restaurant in Chinatown. Not exactly Westridge tuition bracket." She glanced at him. I started last year. First few weeks were rough, but it gets better. Did everyone know you were on scholarship? Jamal asked. Pretty much, Maya admitted. There aren't many of us, so we kind of stand out. But most people don't care once they get to know you. She hesitated before adding, though your situation is a bit different. Because of the lake thing? Jamal guessed. And because it's the Blackwell Scholarship, Maya explained. Richard Blackwell is like royalty around here. His company funded the new science wing, and his daughter used to attend before. She trailed off awkwardly. Before she died, Jamal finished quietly. He told me about her. Maya's eyebrows rose in surprise. He did? Wow. People say he never talks about her. They reached Mr. Harrington's classroom, where Jamal endured another introduction as the new Blackwell Scholar. History passed in a blur of names and dates far more detailed than anything his previous school had covered. By the time lunch period arrived, Jamal's head was swimming with new information. The dining hall was another shock to his system. Unlike Franklin's utilitarian cafeteria, with its plastic trays and limited options, Westridge's dining facilities resembled an upscale restaurant. Students moved through a food court, offering everything from sushi to made-to-order pasta. The seating area featured polished wooden tables and comfortable chairs, rather than the long benches Jamal was accustomed to. Standing uncertainly with his tray of food, Jamal scanned the crowded room for Maya, who had gone ahead while he navigated the overwhelming food options. He spotted her waving from a table near the windows and made his way over, conscious of the stares following him. Saved you a seat, Maya said as he approached. She introduced him to two other students at the table, David, a lanky boy with a mop of curly hair, and Sophia, who wore a hijab and spoke with a slight British accent. You're the one who rescued that dog from the lake, right? David asked immediately. That was all over the news. Jamal nodded uncomfortably, poking at his pasta. Yeah, that was me. That was brave, Sophia said earnestly. My uncle is a doctor, and he says hypothermia can set in within minutes in water that cold. I didn't really think about it, Jamal admitted. I just saw the dog struggling and jumped in. Their conversation was interrupted when a tall, athletic boy stopped by their table, flanked by two friends. So you're Blackwell's new project, he said, his tone making the words sound less than friendly. Carter, Maya said with obvious irritation. Don't you have somewhere else to be? Just wanted to welcome our newest charity case, Carter replied, his eyes never leaving Jamal. I'm Carter Reynolds. My father's on the board here. He extended his hand with exaggerated formality. Jamal reluctantly shook it, immediately disliking the boy's condescending smile. Jamal Williams. Oh, we all know who you are, Carter said. The boy who jumped in a lake and won the lottery. Must be nice having the richest man in the city feeling sorry for you. That's enough, Carter, Maya snapped, but Carter continued as if she hadn't spoken. Just curious, did Blackwell adopt you, or are you just the replacement for his dead daughter? The table fell silent, the cruelty of the question hanging in the air. Jamal felt his chest tighten, both from anger and the familiar warning sign of his asthma responding to stress. You should leave, David said, standing up. Carter raised his hands in mock surrender. Just making conversation. See you around, scholarship kid. He sauntered away, his friends laughing as they followed. Ignore him, Sophia advised, her kind eyes full of concern. Carter's father has been trying to get Richard Blackwell's attention for years. He's just jealous. During his physical education class that afternoon, Jamal struggled to keep pace during the running exercises. The school's state-of-the-art gymnasium was impressive, but the focus on competitive sports highlighted his physical limitations. As he slowed, reaching for his inhaler, he noticed several students, including Carter, watching him with barely concealed disdain. Need a break already, Williams? The coach called out, not unkindly, but loud enough for everyone to hear. Take 5 and use your medication if needed. Embarrassed, Jamal moved to the sidelines, using his inhaler while trying to avoid eye contact with his classmates. His breathing soon eased, but the feeling of being an outsider only intensified. Later, as he changed back into his uniform in the locker room, he overheard Carter speaking to his friends nearby. Blackwell must be scraping the bottom of the barrel, Carter was saying. Kid can't even run a lap without having an attack. What's next? Bringing in wheelchair cases for diversity points? Jamal kept his head down, focusing on tying his shoes while fighting back both anger and humiliation. He had faced bullies before at Franklin, but there he'd had the advantage of familiarity, of knowing his place in the school's social hierarchy. Here, he was defined solely by his connection to Richard Blackwell and the dramatic circumstances that had brought them together. After his final class, Jamal discovered a flyer about the junior veterinary program pinned to a community bulletin board. Reading through the details, he felt a spark of genuine excitement for the first time that day. The application deadline was in 2 days, barely enough time to complete the required essay and gather teacher recommendations. As he stood contemplating the opportunity, Maya appeared beside him. "You should definitely apply," she said, noticing his interest in the flyer. "It's super competitive, but with your background, you'd be perfect." While waiting for his mother to pick him up, Jamal sat on a bench in the garden, watching as other students departed in luxury SUVs and town cars. Carter passed by with his friends, deliberately dropping a newspaper at Jamal's feet. It was open to the article about the lake rescue, now with cruel annotations scribbled in the margins. "Hey, scholarship kid," Carter called out as he walked away. "Is it true you live in an apartment so small you have to share a bedroom with your mom?" Jamal crumpled the newspaper in his hands, the cruel annotations and Carter's words burning in his mind. He stared at the wadded paper, his breathing becoming increasingly labored as anger mixed with humiliation. The familiar tightening in his chest warned of an approaching asthma attack, but the emotions coursing through him made it difficult to care. "Don't let him get to you," Maya said, approaching the bench after witnessing the exchange. "Carter's been insufferable since his father's company lost a major contract to Blackwell Enterprises last year." Jamal nodded silently, trying to control his breathing. He reached for his inhaler, taking a measured puff as Maya sat beside him. The medication helped, but the tension in his chest remained, a physical manifestation of the stress that had been building since his first day at Westridge 3 weeks ago. "Does it ever get easier?" he asked finally, his voice quieter than intended. Maya considered the question, her expression thoughtful. "The academics, yes, the social stuff." She shrugged. "Some people here will never see past your scholarship, but you find your people eventually." A silver sedan pulled up to the curb, and Jamal recognized his mother behind the wheel. "That's my mom," he said, gathering his things. "Thanks for today." "See you tomorrow," Maya replied. "And don't forget about the veterinary program application. It's due Friday." In the car, Tanya immediately sensed her son's mood. "Rough day?" she asked, navigating away from the school's circular driveway where luxury vehicles lined up for student pickup. "Just the usual," Jamal mumbled, staring out the window as the manicured grounds of Westridge gave way to the city streets. He didn't elaborate, and Tanya didn't press. This had become their routine over the past weeks. His quiet withdrawal, her careful respect of his space while worrying silently. Their new apartment, while modestly furnished, was a significant upgrade from their previous home. Located in a safer neighborhood closer to Westridge, it featured 2 bedrooms, reliable heating, and windows that actually sealed properly against the spring rain. Tanya's position at the Blackwell Foundation provided not only a better salary, but also housing assistance that made the place affordable. As they entered, Jamal headed straight for his room, a luxury he was still adjusting to after years of sharing a cramped studio with his mother. He closed the door softly and sat on his bed, pulling out the veterinary program flyer. Despite the challenges of Westridge, the opportunity to work with real veterinarians and animals ignited a spark of genuine excitement. He was halfway through the application essay when Tanya knocked gently on his door. "Dinner in 20 minutes, she called, "and I made your favorite." The small gesture, her attempt to brighten his day, made a lump form in his throat. During dinner, Tanya tried again, to draw him out. "I saw your biology test on the counter. An A- is impressive, especially considering how advanced their curriculum is." Jamal pushed his food around his plate. "Dr. Leibowitz says I have a natural aptitude for anatomy," he admitted. "She's writing one of my recommendation letters for the vet program." Tanya's face brightened. "That's wonderful. When would the program start?" "Next month, if I get in. It's every Saturday for 8 weeks. He hesitated before adding, "But it's really competitive. Most of the kids who apply have parents who are doctors or scientists. And most of those kids haven't been studying veterinary textbooks since they were 8, Tanya countered, reaching across the table to squeeze his hand. "You've earned this opportunity, Jamal. Don't let anyone make you think otherwise." The following week, Jamal's acceptance to the veterinary program arrived via email, bringing a rare smile to his face. Dr. Leibowitz congratulated him publicly during biology class, noting that he was one of only 12 students selected citywide. "Your essay on comparative respiratory systems was particularly impressive," she told him as class ended. "It showed insight beyond your years, especially your observations about asthma treatments and their potential applications in treating animal respiratory conditions." Maya beamed at him as they walked to their next class. "See? I told you you'd get in." "This is a big deal, Jamal. The program is a direct pipeline to the university's pre-veterinary summer academy for high schoolers." For the first time since starting at Westridge, Jamal felt a genuine sense of accomplishment, one based on his own merits, rather than his connection to Richard Blackwell. The feeling was short-lived, however, when he overheard Carter in the hallway later that day. "Of course Williams got into the vet program," Carter was saying loudly to his friends as Jamal approached his locker. "Blackwell probably donated another wing to make sure his pet project got accepted." Jamal froze, his hand on his locker combination. He'd worked hard on his application, staying up late to perfect his essay and gathering impressive recommendations. The suggestion that his acceptance was just another handout stung worse than any previous taunt. "What's your problem, Carter?" Jamal asked, turning to face the older boy. The hallway quieted as other students sensed the confrontation brewing. Carter smirked, clearly pleased to have provoked a reaction. "No problem at all. Just wondering what it's like to have everything handed to you because some rich guy feels guilty his dog almost drowned." "I earned my spot in that program," Jamal said, his voice steady despite the anger building inside him. "Just like I earned my place at this school." "Did you?" Carter stepped closer, using his height advantage to look down at Jamal. "Or are you just here because you're Blackwell's charity case? The replacement for his dead daughter?" The hallway went completely silent, the cruelty of Carter's words hanging in the air. Jamal felt a rush of heat flood his face, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. His breathing became shallow, but this time it wasn't asthma. It was pure rage. "Take that back," Jamal demanded, his voice low and dangerous. Carter's smirk widened. "Why should I? Everyone knows it's true. You're nothing special. Just a poor kid from the east side who got lucky. If you hadn't jumped in that lake, you'd still be in your pathetic public school where you belong." Something snapped inside Jamal. Before he could think, he shoved Carter hard, sending the larger boy stumbling backward into the lockers with a loud crash. Surprise flashed across Carter's face, quickly replaced by anger as he regained his balance and lunged forward. What followed was a brief but chaotic scuffle. Carter threw a punch that grazed Jamal's cheek, and Jamal responded by tackling the older boy to the ground. They rolled across the hallway. Floor, a tangle of uniformed blazers and flying fists, surrounded by a growing circle of shocked students. "Fight! Fight!" someone yelled, and within seconds, teachers emerged from nearby classrooms. Mr. Harrington and the physical education coach pulled the boys apart, each struggling to restrain the still furious students. "That's enough," Mr. Harrington shouted, his grip firm on Jamal's shoulders. "Both of you, to the principal's office. Now!" Breathing hard, Jamal felt the familiar tightness returning to his chest, this time definitely asthma, triggered by the physical exertion and emotional stress. He reached for his inhaler as the coach marched Carter away, the older boy sporting a bloody nose and a torn blazer. In Principal Hammond's office, Jamal sat alone for nearly 30 minutes, using his inhaler twice more as his breathing gradually stabilized. His cheek throbbed where Carter's punch had connected, and his uniform was disheveled, the tie hanging loosely around his neck. When the door finally opened, it wasn't just Principal Hammond who entered, but also Carter and his father, a tall man in an expensive suit who bore a striking resemblance to his son. Mr. Hammond, a stern-looking man with salt and pepper hair, took his seat behind the desk with a grave expression. "Ms. Jackson is calling your mother, Jamal," he said, his tone disappointingly neutral. "And Mr. Reynolds has already arrived to discuss this unfortunate incident." Mr. Reynolds placed a hand on Carter's shoulder. "My son has explained what happened, Principal Hammond. While I don't condone fighting, it seems clear who the aggressor was in this situation." "That's not true," Jamal protested, his voice still raspy from the asthma attack. "He was saying horrible things about..." "About what?" Mr. Reynolds interrupted. "About the unusual circumstances of your scholarship? That hardly justifies a physical assault." Before Jamal could respond, the door opened again, and Tanya rushed in, still wearing her Blackwell Foundation ID badge. Her eyes immediately went to Jamal's face, taking in the bruise forming on his cheek. "What happened?" she demanded, moving to stand beside her son. Principal Hammond cleared his throat. "Mrs. Williams, I'm afraid Jamal was involved in a physical altercation with another student. Our school has a zero-tolerance policy for violence." "He attacked my son," Mr. Reynolds added, his tone condescending. "Unprovoked, according to multiple witnesses." "That's not what happened," Jamal insisted, looking desperately at his mother. "He was saying things about me being a charity case and about Mr. Blackwell's daughter." "Regardless of what was said," Principal Hammond interjected, "physical violence is never the answer." Given the seriousness of this incident, Jamal will be suspended for 3 days, effective immediately. Tanya's eyes widened in disbelief. "Suspended? What about the other boy? It sounds like he was provoking Jamal deliberately." "Carter will receive appropriate consequences as well," Principal Hammond said, though his tone lacked conviction. "We take all forms of misconduct seriously at Westridge." Mr. Reynolds scoffed. "My son was defending himself against an unprovoked attack. If anything, we're being lenient, not pressing charges." A tense silence filled the office as Tanya stared at the principal, then at Mr. Reynolds, realization dawning on her face. "I see what's happening here," she said quietly. "This isn't about what actually occurred. This is about who has power and influence at this school." The door opened once more, and Richard Blackwell entered, his presence immediately commanding the room's attention. All eyes turned to him in surprise. "Mr. Blackwell," Principal Hammond said, quickly rising from his seat. "We weren't expecting you. I called your office as a courtesy, but..." "And my assistant contacted me immediately," Richard replied coolly, surveying the room. "I understand there's been an incident involving Jamal." Mr. Reynolds stepped forward, extending his hand. "Richard, good to see you. We were just sorting out this unfortunate situation. Boys will be boys, after all." Richard ignored the offered hand, instead moving to stand beside Jamal and Tanya. "I'd like to hear exactly what happened, from both students." Carter shifted uncomfortably under Richard's gaze as Principal Hammond explained the situation, carefully emphasizing the school's zero-tolerance policy for physical altercations. When he finished, Richard turned to Jamal. "Is that an accurate account?" he asked quietly. Jamal took a deep breath, wincing slightly at the lingering tightness in his chest. "He's been making comments since my first day here. Today he said I only got into the veterinary program because you bought my way in. Then he said..." His voice faltered. "He said I was just a replacement for your daughter." Richard's expression hardened almost imperceptibly, but his voice remained calm as he addressed Principal Hammond. "And what disciplinary action will Carter face for this targeted harassment?" The principal hesitated, glancing nervously at Mr. Reynolds. "We're still investigating the verbal exchange, but as for the physical incident, which my son did not initiate," Mr. Reynolds interrupted. "The Reynolds family has been a significant supporter of Westridge for generations," Principal Hammond added delicately. "Carter's grandfather served on our board for 30 years. We must consider..." "The context?" Richard suggested, his tone dangerously soft. "Like the context that Jamal has endured weeks of bullying without complaint? Or the context that Carter deliberately invoked my deceased daughter to provoke him?" An uncomfortable silence fell over the office. Tanya, who had been watching the exchange with growing frustration, finally spoke up, her voice vibrating with controlled anger. "This is unacceptable," she declared, looking directly at Principal Hammond. "If this is how Westridge handles justice, then perhaps this isn't the right place for my son after all." Richard appeared taken aback by her statement, struggling to find a response as Tanya continued, "We appreciate the opportunity, but not at the cost of Jamal's dignity and fair treatment." As security personnel began searching the campus and Richard instructed his driver to check nearby streets, Tanya's phone vibrated with a message from Jamal. "Sorry for being a problem for you and Mr. Blackwell. Need some time alone. Don't worry." Tanya felt her heart stop as she read Jamal's message. The words, "don't worry," did exactly the opposite, sending a wave of panic through her body. "He's gone," she said, her voice barely audible, as she held up her phone for Richard to see. "Jamal's run away." Richard immediately took charge, instructing security to search the school grounds while directing his driver to check nearby streets. Within minutes, the school administration had mobilized a search team, the previous conflict temporarily forgotten in the face of a missing child. "He can't have gone far," Principal Hammond assured them, though his words provided little comfort. "We have cameras at all exits." As they reviewed the security footage, they discovered Jamal had slipped out through a side entrance during the commotion following the fight, nearly 20 minutes before anyone realized he was missing. "He knows the city," Tanya said, trying to remain calm despite her growing fear. "But he's upset, and his asthma was acting up after the fight." Richard pulled out his phone. "I'll have my security team check the bus routes in nearby parks. Is there anywhere specific he might go? Somewhere he feels safe?" Tanya thought for a moment. "The library near our old apartment, the community center. Maybe..." Her eyes widened with sudden realization. "The lake, where it all started." Richard nodded, already texting his driver. "I'll go there now. You should check the library and community center." "I should come with you to the lake," Tanya insisted, but Richard shook his head. "We need to cover more ground. My driver can take you to the other locations." His expression softened slightly. "I promise I'll find him, Tanya." 40 minutes later, Richard's car pulled up alongside Henderson Park. The spring afternoon had turned cool, with gray clouds threatening rain as he walked briskly along the path toward the lake. The scene was dramatically different from the frozen landscape of 2 months earlier. The ice long melted, replaced by dark water rippling in the light breeze. As he approached the shoreline, Richard spotted a solitary figure sitting on a bench overlooking the water. Relief flooded through him as he recognized Jamal's slumped shoulders and the distinctive blue blazer of Westridge Academy. Richard slowed his pace, carefully considering his approach. The boy's posture radiated dejection, and Richard could see from a distance that he was breathing with deliberate control, clearly struggling with his asthma but trying to manage it. Before Richard could call out, a flash of golden fur caught his attention. To his utter astonishment, Max bounded along the path toward Jamal, having somehow escaped from Richard's car where the driver had been watching him. Jamal looked up in surprise as the dog approached, his expression transforming from misery to disbelief as Max pressed against his legs, tail wagging enthusiastically. "Max?" Jamal whispered, his hand automatically reaching to stroke the dog's head. "What are you doing here?" Richard watched this unexpected reunion from a distance, struck by how immediately Jamal's body language changed. Shoulders relaxing, breathing easing, at the simple presence of the dog. After giving them a moment, Richard walked forward, making enough noise that his approach wouldn't startle the boy. Jamal looked up, unsurprised to see him. "I figured you'd find me eventually," Jamal said, his voice hoarse. "Max kind of gave away my hiding spot." "He has a tracking chip in his collar," Richard explained, stopping a few feet away. "Though I admit I didn't expect him to find you before I did. He was supposed to stay in the car." The ghost of a smile crossed Jamal's face as he continued petting Max. "He's smarter than people give him credit for." Richard gestured to the empty space on the bench. "May I?" Jamal nodded, shifting slightly to make room. Richard sat down, maintaining a respectful distance while Max settled comfortably between them, head resting on Jamal's knee. For several minutes, neither spoke. The gentle lapping of water against the shore filled the silence as dark clouds continued gathering overhead. "I've already texted your mother," Richard finally said. "Let her know you're safe." Jamal nodded, his gaze fixed on the water. "I'm sorry for running off." "I think you had your reasons," Richard replied, following the boy's gaze to the spot where, not so long ago, a frozen surface had given way beneath them both. "Everyone at that school thinks I'm just your charity case," Jamal said suddenly, the words bursting out as if he couldn't contain them any longer. "Even the teachers treat me differently, and no matter what I do, no matter how hard I work, that's all I'll ever be to them." Richard considered his response carefully. People can be cruel when they feel threatened or insecure. "Carter said I'm just a replacement for your daughter," Jamal continued, his voice cracking slightly. "Is that true? Is that why you're helping us?" The directness of the question caught Richard off guard. He turned to look at Jamal properly, noting the bruise forming on the boy's cheek and the weariness in his eyes that no 13-year-old should carry. "When I first saw you in that hospital bed," Richard began slowly, "I did feel a connection to Emily. You're around the age she was when she died, and your courage reminded me of her strength through her illness." Jamal's shoulders tensed, but Richard continued, "That initial reaction doesn't define our relationship now, Jamal. No one could replace Emily, and you deserve to be recognized for who you are, not who she was." A raindrop landed on the bench between them, followed by another. Neither moved. "I don't know who I am anymore," Jamal admitted quietly. "At my old school, I was just the quiet kid who liked animals. Now I'm the Blackwell scholar, or the kid from the lake. I feel like everything I do is because of you, not because of me." The pain in the boy's voice struck Richard deeply. For the first time, he fully grasped the unintended consequences of his well-intentioned intervention. In trying to provide opportunities for Jamal, he had inadvertently burdened him with an identity defined entirely by their connection. "I understand that feeling," Richard said after a moment. "After I made my first million, people stopped seeing me as Richard Blackwell the person." I became Richard Blackwell, the success story, the businessman, the philanthropist. More raindrops fell, creating small circles on the lake's surface. But that's different, Jamal argued. You earned your success. And you earned your place at Westridge, Richard countered. Your test scores and grades prove that. The scholarship recognizes your potential, not my charity. Jamal's breathing suddenly became more labored, and he reached for his inhaler, taking a quick puff. Max whined softly, pressing closer to the boy, as if sensing his distress. I forgot my backup inhaler, Jamal admitted, looking worriedly at the nearly empty one in his hand. This one's almost out. Without hesitation, Richard reached into his jacket pocket and produced an identical inhaler. I've carried one since the day at the lake, he explained, handing it to Jamal. Just in case. Surprise registered on Jamal's face as he accepted the medication. You carry an inhaler for me? Richard hesitated, then decided the moment called for complete honesty. Not originally, he said quietly. I started carrying one after Emily died. She had severe asthma alongside her leukemia. Her final crisis came when she had an asthma attack that her weakened system couldn't handle. I was traveling for business. By the time I got to the hospital, he trailed off, the memory still too painful to articulate fully. The rain began falling more steadily now, but neither moved to seek shelter. I'm sorry, Jamal said softly. I didn't know her asthma was that bad. In many ways, you remind me of her, Richard acknowledged. Your kindness toward animals, your intelligence, your courage. But I see you for who you are, Jamal. A remarkable young man with your own identity and future. As the rain intensified, Max shook himself, sending water droplets flying, which unexpectedly caused both Jamal and Richard to laugh. The moment of lightness broke some of the tension between them. We should probably get out of the rain, Richard suggested. Your mother is worried. Jamal nodded but didn't immediately move. I don't think I can go back to Westridge, he said finally. Not after today. That's a decision for you and your mother, Richard replied. But whatever you decide, your scholarship remains. It can transfer to any school of your choice. They walked together toward Richard's waiting car, Max trotting happily alongside them despite the downpour. Before they reached the vehicle, Jamal stopped, turning to face Richard fully for the first time. Why do you care so much? He asked, rain streaming down his face. About me, about my mom. You barely know us. Richard considered the question, recognizing its importance. When I saw you jump into that lake, without hesitation, risking your life for a stranger's dog, it reminded me of something I had forgotten in my years of business success and personal loss. Some things simply don't have a price. Richard's words hung in the rain-soaked air between them, simple yet profound. Jamal looked up at him, water streaming down his face, masking whether there might be tears mixed with the raindrops. After a moment, he nodded, a gesture of understanding if not complete acceptance. We should get you home, Richard said gently. Your mother's worried sick. The drive back was quiet. Max settled contentedly between them in the back seat of Richard's luxury car, his wet fur creating dark patches on the leather upholstery that neither human commented on. Jamal stared out the window, watching the familiar city streets pass by. Streets that somehow looked different now, as though his perspective had permanently shifted. When they arrived at the apartment building, Tanya was waiting in the lobby, pacing anxiously. The moment she saw Jamal, she rushed forward, pulling him into a tight embrace that conveyed both relief and lingering fear. Don't you ever do that again, she whispered fiercely against his hair before pulling back to examine his face. Are you okay? Your asthma? I'm fine, Mom, Jamal assured her, though his voice remained subdued. Mr. Blackwell had an extra inhaler. Tanya's eyes moved to Richard, who stood slightly apart, giving mother and son their moment. Her expression held a complex mixture of gratitude and something else, perhaps a new understanding between them. Back in their apartment, after Jamal had showered and changed into dry clothes, the three sat in the small living room. Max lay at Jamal's feet, seemingly unwilling to leave the boy's side. The atmosphere was heavy with unresolved questions. "I'm not going back to Westridge," Jamal stated flatly, breaking the silence. His tone left no room for debate. Tanya nodded slowly. "I understand. What happened today shouldn't have happened, and the school's response was..." She trailed off, exchanging a glance with Richard. "Inequitable," Richard finished for her. "And I want to apologize for my part in that. I thought Westridge would provide opportunities, not obstacles." "It's not your fault," Jamal said, surprising both. "Adults." "You were trying to help." Richard leaned forward in his chair, his expression earnest. "Nevertheless, I've been thinking about what you said at the lake, Jamal. About feeling defined by our connection rather than your own merits. You were right, and I should have considered that more carefully." "So what happens now?" Tanya asked, her hand resting protectively on Jamal's shoulder. Richard reached for his briefcase, removing several brochures, which he placed on the coffee table. "These are 3 schools with excellent science programs and diverse student populations. All have partnerships with local universities for advanced placement courses in biological sciences." Jamal tentatively picked up the top brochure, featuring a group of students of various ethnicities working together in a modern laboratory. "Hillside Academy?" "Their science curriculum is outstanding," Richard explained. "Less prestigious than Westridge in terms of social cachet, perhaps, but arguably superior in actual education, particularly in the life sciences. They have a veterinary mentorship program with the university." "And you've already arranged for him to transfer there, I assume?" Tanya asked, a hint of her old defensiveness returning. Richard shook his head. "I've merely confirmed that his scholarship would transfer if that's what you both decide. The choice is entirely yours." He paused, carefully selecting his next words. "I've learned that my help is most valuable when it expands options rather than dictates them." 2 months later, Jamal walked confidently through the halls of Hillside Academy, his new school uniform, navy pants and a simple white button-down with the school crest, feeling more comfortable than Westridge's formal blazer ever had. Students greeted him as he made his way to advanced biology, some by name, others with casual nods, but none with the whispers or pointed stares that had followed him at Westridge. "Jamal, wait up!" called a voice behind him. He turned to see Eliza, a fellow science enthusiast with bright purple highlights in her dark hair, something that would have never been permitted at Westridge. "Did you finish the biodiversity project?" she asked, falling into step beside him. "Ms. Patel says our class is presenting first today." "Finished it last night," Jamal confirmed, pulling a carefully labeled folder from his backpack. "I focused on respiratory adaptations across mammalian species." "Of course you did," Eliza laughed without a trace of mockery. "You're going to be the best vet the city's ever seen." In the classroom, students arranged themselves in project groups, the atmosphere collaborative rather than competitive. Ms. Patel, a young biology teacher with a PhD in molecular genetics, approached Jamal's table. "Your analysis of bronchial structures was quite sophisticated, Jamal," she commented while reviewing his project. "Have you considered applying for the special internship program at the community clinic? The deadline is next week." "The veterinary apprenticeship?" Jamal asked, his interest piqued. "I didn't know applications were open yet." "They just announced it yesterday," Ms. Patel explained. "Only 2 students from each partner school will be selected. Given your expertise and interest, you should definitely apply." After class, Jamal texted his mother about the internship opportunity, receiving an enthusiastic response encouraging him to pursue it. Her new position at the healthcare advocacy nonprofit, where she had ultimately chosen to work instead of Richard's foundation, allowed her a more flexible schedule and the satisfaction of helping families navigate complex medical systems. something her own experiences had uniquely qualified her for. That weekend, Richard invited Jamal and Tanya to visit a building in their old neighborhood. The text had been cryptically brief. "Something I'd like to show you both. Important project. 2 p.m. Saturday." When they arrived at the address, Jamal was surprised to find it was the formerly abandoned medical office building on East Maple Street, just 3 blocks from their old apartment. Now, scaffolding covered the exterior, and construction workers moved purposefully in and out of the entrance, carrying materials and equipment. Richard greeted them outside, dressed casually in jeans and a polo shirt rather than his usual business attire. Max was at his side, wearing his therapy dog vest. "What is all this?" Tanya asked, gesturing to the construction activity. "The future home of the Emily Blackwell Community Health Center," Richard replied, a note of quiet pride in his voice. "Focusing on respiratory care and preventative medicine, with a companion animal therapy program and a veterinary care clinic for families who can't afford traditional vet services." Jamal stared at the building in amazement. "You're building this here? In our old neighborhood?" "It's where it's most needed," Richard said simply. "Come inside, I'll show you the plans." As they toured the partially renovated building, Richard explained how the clinic would operate on a sliding-scale payment system, ensuring that no one would be turned away due to inability to pay. One section was dedicated to asthma education and management, while another housed what would become a fully equipped veterinary clinic. "The vet clinic will have an educational component," Richard explained, showing them a room with classroom-style seating facing an examination area. Students interested in veterinary medicine can observe and assist with basic procedures. Jamal walked the space in quiet amazement, trying to reconcile the dusty construction site with the state-of-the-art facility depicted in the architectural renderings Richard showed them. As they continued the tour, Jamal noticed several familiar faces among the construction workers and administrative staff, setting up temporary offices. "Isn't that Mr. Davis from our old building?" he asked his mother, pointing to an older man installing electrical fixtures. Tanya nodded, her expression surprised. "And that's Mrs. Alvarez from the corner market, and Dayon from the community center." "We're hiring from within the community whenever possible," Richard explained. "From construction through to staffing once we're operational. This isn't a charity dropped into the neighborhood. It's being built by and for the people who live here." Near what would become the main reception area, they passed a wall with a simple plaque, "In memory of Emily Blackwell, whose compassion inspired healing." Beside it was a framed photograph of a smiling young girl with a golden retriever puppy, clearly a younger Max, in her lap. Richard paused briefly at the photo, touching it gently before continuing the tour. The gesture was so private that both Jamal and Tanya pretended not to notice, understanding the significance without needing explanation. At the end of the tour, they exited through the back of the building into what Richard explained would become a community garden, specializing in medicinal plants and vegetables for a food is medicine program. Several neighborhood residents were already working the newly prepared soil, planting seedlings under the guidance of an urban agriculture specialist. "This is amazing," Tanya said finally, taking in the scope of the project. "But why show us specifically? This seems like something you'd announce publicly." Richard smiled, the expression reaching his eyes in a way that had become more common over the recent months. "Because none of this would exist without Jamal. His courage that day at the lake didn't just save Max. It saved something in me, too. It reminded me that making a real difference means getting your hands dirty, taking personal risks, not just writing checks from a distance." Jamal absorbed this, feeling a complex mix of emotions. For the first time since the rescue, the connection to Richard felt like something that defined neither of them exclusively, but rather existed as its own worthy thing between them. As they walked back to their car, Richard checked his watch and mentioned casually, "I almost forgot. I have a surprise for your birthday tomorrow, Jamal." something that Max helped to choose and that I believe will symbolize the new beginning for all of us. Jamal couldn't help but feel intrigued by Richard's mention of a birthday surprise as he and his mother drove home from the clinic site. Turning 13 had never felt particularly significant before, but something in Richard's tone suggested this would be different from any birthday he'd previously experienced. "What do you think it could be?" he asked his mother, who smiled mysteriously. "I might have some idea," Tanya admitted, "but I promised not to spoil it. You'll find out tomorrow." That night, Jamal found it difficult to sleep, his mind alternating between excitement about his birthday and reflections on how dramatically his life had changed in the months since that freezing February morning when he jumped into Henderson Lake. The boy who had impulsively dived into icy water to save a stranger's dog seemed like a different person now, or perhaps more accurately, a less complete version of who he was becoming. The next morning, Jamal woke to the smell of his favorite breakfast, blueberry pancakes with maple syrup. He found his mother already dressed in casual but nice clothes, humming as she flipped the last pancake onto a growing stack. "Happy birthday, sweetheart," she said, pulling him into a warm hug. 13 years old. I can hardly believe it." "Thanks, Mom," he replied, noticing a small pile of wrapped presents on the kitchen table. "You didn't have to go all out." "It's not every day my son becomes a teenager," she countered, setting the plate of pancakes on the table. "And this birthday feels special, doesn't it? After everything that's happened?" Jamal nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. As they ate breakfast, he opened his gifts: a new scientific calculator, 2 advanced books on veterinary medicine, and a digital watch that could monitor his heart rate and oxygen levels, perfect for managing his asthma during physical activities. "These are perfect, Mom," he said sincerely, strapping the watch to his wrist. "Thank you." "There's one more thing," Tanya said, glancing at the clock. "But for that, we need to head over to the community garden behind the clinic site. Richard asked us to meet him there at noon." The community garden had been transformed since their visit the previous day. Green balloons, Jamal's favorite color, were tied to the newly installed benches, and a small table had been set up with a homemade birthday cake. Several of Jamal's classmates from Hillside Academy were there, along with some former neighbors from their old building, and even Maya from Westridge, who had remained a friend despite his transfer. "Surprise!" they called as Jamal and Tanya entered the garden, causing him to stop in his tracks, momentarily overwhelmed by the gathering. "Happy birthday, Jamal," Richard said, approaching with Max at his heels. The golden retriever immediately moved to Jamal's side, tail wagging enthusiastically as he always did when greeting the boy. "You did all this?" Jamal asked, taking in the decorations and assembled guests. "Your mother did most of it," Richard replied with a smile. "I just provided the space." The small party was unlike any birthday celebration Jamal had experienced before. There was a comfortable mix of his two worlds, friends from school chatting easily with people from the neighborhood, his mother relaxed and laughing with the parents of his classmates. Even Dr. Leibowitz from Westridge had come, bringing news that Jamal's research on comparative respiratory systems had been submitted to a junior science journal for publication. Later, as Jamal was cutting his cake, decorated with an anatomically correct diagram of a canine heart that had made everyone laugh, Richard approached with what looked like an envelope. "Before you serve the cake, I thought this might be a good time for my gift," he said, his voice carrying enough to quiet the gathering. "Though it's not just from me." Curious, Jamal accepted the envelope. Inside was an official-looking document with gold embossing along the border. As he read the contents, his eyes widened in disbelief. "This is a college fund?" he asked, looking up at Richard in confusion. "The Jamal Williams Veterinary Medicine Scholarship Fund," Richard confirmed. "Fully funded to cover your undergraduate and veterinary school education when the time comes." Jamal stared at the document, speechless. Attending veterinary school had always been his dream, but the astronomical costs had made it seem like just that, a distant dream rather than an achievable goal. "I don't know what to say," he finally managed, his voice thick with emotion. "There's more to it than that," Richard continued, gesturing for Tanya to join them. "The fund wasn't created by me alone. When word spread about what you did that day at the lake, people wanted to contribute." Tanya gently took the document from Jamal's hands, her eyes moist as she examined it. "The fund has over 50 individual donors, Jamal. People from the neighborhood, teachers from both your schools, even some of the hospital staff who treated you. People believe in you, Jamal," Richard said simply. "Not because of your connection to me, but because of who you are. The courage you showed that day at the lake inspired others to help ensure your future." The revelation left Jamal momentarily unable to speak. The idea that so many people, many of whom he'd never met, had contributed to his future was overwhelming. As the gathering processed this news, Richard made a subtle gesture toward his car, where his driver was waiting. The man nodded and opened the vehicle's back door, reaching inside for something. "There's one more surprise," Richard said, as his driver approached carrying a small crate with air holes. "This one is more from Max than from me." The crate emitted a soft whining sound that immediately captured Jamal's full attention. Richard set it down carefully on the ground and opened the small door. A moment later, a golden retriever puppy tumbled out, its fur a slightly deeper shade than Max's, but with the same soulful eyes and enthusiastic tail. "This is Nova," Richard explained as the puppy immediately made a beeline for Jamal, sniffing his shoes excitedly. "She's Max's niece from his sister's recent litter. The breeder says she has the same temperament that made Max such a good therapy dog." Jamal knelt down, letting the puppy climb into his lap, her whole body wiggling with excitement as she tried to lick his face. "She's mine?" he asked, his voice filled with disbelief. "If you want her," Richard confirmed. "She's already had her first round of training, though she'll need plenty more. I thought perhaps you might want to train her as a therapy dog yourself. She could work with patients at the clinic once she's certified." The puppy was already wearing a green collar that matched the color of the jacket Jamal had been wearing on the day of the rescue. Attached to it was a small tag engraved with her name and Jamal's contact information. "She's perfect," Jamal whispered, cradling the wiggling puppy against his chest. The party continued around them, but for a moment, Jamal remained on the ground with Nova exploring his lap, while Max sat regally beside them, occasionally nudging the puppy back when she wandered too far. Richard and Tanya stood slightly apart, watching the scene with matching expressions of contentment. "Thank you," Tanya said quietly, her eyes never leaving her son. "Not just for today, but for everything. For seeing his potential." "I should be thanking you," Richard replied, "for raising such an extraordinary young man, and for teaching me something important about what really matters." As the afternoon progressed, guests eventually began to depart, each stopping to wish Jamal happy birthday and admire his new puppy. Maya, the last of his school friends to leave, knelt to scratch Nova behind the ears. "She's adorable," she said before standing to go. "See you at the veterinary program next Saturday?" "Definitely," Jamal confirmed, the puppy now sleeping contentedly in his arms, exhausted from all the attention and play. Soon, only Jamal, Tanya, Richard, and the dogs remained in the garden. The sun was beginning to set, casting a warm golden light over the newly planted beds and freshly installed benches. "So, how does it feel to be 13? Richard asked, taking a seat on one of the benches. "Different," Jamal admitted, carefully shifting the sleeping puppy in his arms, "but good different." "The next few years will be important ones," Richard said thoughtfully. "High school, college decisions, veterinary school applications. But something tells me you're going to handle it all remarkably well." A comfortable silence fell between them as they watched the sunset together, not as benefactor and recipients of charity, but as friends who had found each other through extraordinary circumstances and forged a genuine connection. Nova stirred in Jamal's arms, yawning widely before settling back to sleep. He gently stroked her soft fur, marveling at how perfectly the day had turned out. "You know," Jamal said quietly, looking from Nova to Max, who was resting contentedly at Richard's feet, "I should probably start her swimming lessons soon, just to be safe." Richard laughed, the sound full and genuine. "Probably a good idea, though she comes from a long line of water dogs, so it's likely in her blood. Still," Jamal continued with a mischievous smile, "I hope this one isn't quite as good at finding trouble as her uncle was." "I don't know," Richard replied, his eyes twinkling with humor as he glanced at Max. "That particular adventure turned out pretty well in the end, don't you think?" Jamal looked around at his mother, at Richard, at the clinic rising behind them, and finally down at the puppy sleeping trustingly in his arms. "Yeah," he agreed softly, "it really did." While Jamal hugged his new puppy, he whispered in Richard's ear, "I hope this one isn't as good at swimming as his brother." Richard laughed and responded, "For safety's sake, let's start your swimming lessons next week." The two shared a knowing smile, united not by tragedy or obligation, but by a genuine friendship that had transcended social and racial barriers.